So it's my honor today to introduce this next panel and a good friend of mine, Lynda Davis, Dr. Lynda Davis, onto the stage to moderate a panel around corporate investment in mental health, wellness, suicide prevention initiatives. I want to thank our friends at Tri-West Healthcare Alliance for their support of the symposium. Thanks, Glenn and Donna. And Dave, who's not here, but Dave McIntyre used to be a member of our board and continues to be supportive. But I also want to do just a shout out to Lynda while I have the stage. So Dr. Davis, Lynda Davis, and I have known each other for, you are not going to do that. We've known each other for a long time. Come on. But I'd like to introduce this new stage.
I have a panel to run. Will you come
Here you go, ladies and gentlemen. I know, you gotta love it. You should have seen us fighting in the Pentagon.
Oh, but we had fun. If you can call what we all had to face with back then fun. 2003, I came to the Pentagon and stayed there till 2009, and that wasn't fun. It was darn serious. And it's amazing to see how we've come together as a community, everybody in here. And I'm honored to be here with you again in person at AWP. And I have this great panel. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time except two examples I'd like to highlight and a little bit of my bias. All of our bios are in your agenda online. I couldn't read them and find them, of course, but I've had a chance, and each of these wonderful people will say something about themselves and what their mother wrote for them and things like that, you know. But as we come in, we're talking about the key things of wellness, mental health, and suicide prevention. Really serious things to us all. I first got the full force of the suicide epidemic, which was even happening back then when Jim and I were in the Pentagon, when I was able to host the first symposium for wounded warriors, and we included caregivers for the first time. And then I got a call from my friend Bonnie Carroll and said, wait a minute, what about survivors? And then we began to hear about the unique experience of the suicide survivor. So that compelled me, when I went to the VA 10 years later, to hardwire into our language there the importance of dealing with the veteran, the family, the caregiver, and the survivor. And one of the things that's my bias as we look at this panel today and as they speak is I'll be looking for how we address wellness, mental health, and suicide prevention in the context of the family, caregiver, survivor, and the community that you all already get and are making better. The other thing is to look at, when we look at suicide prevention, is our biases, our expectations about what mental health, mental wellness look like are not always right. Jonathan Pruden gave a great example in his symposium this morning about someone who was addicted, and it was primarily because of a vitamin B deficiency, and that person will end up on the street. I was the caregiver of my Korean-era brother-in-law, and in his wheelchair, he called me at 3 in the morning, and I had to take him to the VA Medical Center in D.C. because he was seriously suicidal and was admitted for 2 months. So we can't assume, as many of you have already said, that we know what wellness looks like to a person, that we know what mental health looks like, or that we know what the risk factors for suicide looks like by looking at somebody. But these experts, who each have a unique special role in dealing from their corporate setting with these key issues, are going to tell us a little bit about what they have chosen to do in their corporation, why they're focusing on that, how they're focusing on that, how they're measuring it, who they're working with, you all. And then we're going to get into some lessons learned from that. So I thought we would let's start with mental health. Can we start with you, Doctor?
Okay. Thank you very much, Lynda. I'm Dr. Brian Masterson, and I'm a psychiatrist as well as an internist. And as you see in my bio, I spent quite a bit of time in the military and have had the opportunity to really understand, even from high school, the stress that people are under. And now I see it in the young adults and what they're going through with COVID. And I think that a lot of issues is that people think about mental illness. And I think that one of the things that I talk about with some people is, are you sick or unwell? There's a difference there, okay? Sickness means that is a state, that is a construct. Unwell has the implied willingness to be well. And so I often talk to people and find out which kind of mentality they have. Are they the optimist or the pessimist in life? And I think that that really helps to get you a sense of what is in the construct of mental well-being. The other issue is that with doing both internal medicine and psychiatry, how does this interact? What is the interaction between our medical issues? Okay, I was actually planning on being a transplant surgeon, and up until probably October of my senior year in medical school, I was hardcore going to be a surgeon. And most people say, yes, Brian, you have that surgeon mentality, and that's a whole other story. But I ended up getting the opportunity to go to the University of Iowa and do this med psych program, this integrated program. And what really intrigued me was one night I was up with a patient that we were getting ready for transplant. And it was very interesting to see how his illness had affected his mental well-being and how his state was identified in sickness or in well-being. And it was very interesting that that was when the light switch went on for me, that understanding that we are integrated people, we are whole. But what we do is we separate the mind from the body. Mm-hmm. And so throughout my career, it's how do we put that body and mind back together? There is a thing that occurs between the head and the body, and that's called the neck. And so I guess I'm kind of the neck for the human body, okay? Is how do we connect those things? And it's that sense of well-being and wellness. And so one of the other aspects about this is we have to get away from stigmatizing it. And so we've done a number of initiatives, and how do you destigmatize it? And so a lot of times, and I caught myself in the hospital going in and asking mental status questions, even when I was doing internal medicine cardiac evaluations. And I said, listen, I ask these for everybody because I need to know how your thinking is going so that we can understand that you appreciate the situation you're in. And then how do we move forward with that? And what are your goals? And what are your aspirations? And so I stumbled on to doing existential psychotherapy, which is a whole nother discussion that we can get into. But that existential nature of humans is critical to understanding the suicide and death issues in this country. And that recognizing that in particular with suicide is that it's not a medical issue, it's not a mental health issue, it's a societal issue.
Thank you very much, Brian. And I know that you were informed, a lot of people agree with that position, and you were informed so much by your own service in the military. Dr. Laurie, would you tell us, please, from your perspective, how you come about these issues?
Sure. So this is a rare situation where we've got two people on a panel that are both a dual board.
Right.
It truly is. This is a pleasure to be here. My name is Laurie Heiberger. I'm an internist and psychiatrist, did a dual training as well. I was with the VA for many years.
VISN 18?
In VISN 18, and moved on into Tri-West. So I'm happy to be here. I think when I think of what we've done at Tri-West, there's a couple of things. Some of it's outward facing. It's toward the people that we serve. So the veteran, their caregiver, anyone who's on the other end of that phone, we consider someone that we're working with. But there's also the internal work that we've done. Let me start with the internal. So for our company, there were a couple things that we've done to try to address mental health and those risks of suicidal behaviors or hopelessness in general. One was just creating a video that went out to all of our staff. It was about the time that a few people were coming back into the office. We were concerned about how that adjustment might go for some. We didn't know how they were doing at home as well as when they were in the office and other eyes were upon them. And I think the most fearful thing was people not knowing what to say or do. We had some staff in our company who had losses, some by suicide, some of children. It was very hard for our company to see that happen, and you just want to wrap your arms around that employee and support them, but there's probably 10 more that are in the pre-state of something like that happening, and you can't really narrow your focus down. So we created a video that we shared out to our staff that basically was just highlighting how do you ask a question and then what do you do with the answer you get. So it was, how do you ask the question of how are you doing, how are you adjusting, how are you feeling? It could be very lighthearted. The next step was the information you get back, and that's where people got afraid. They weren't sure how to handle that information. I can tell you there's probably 90 to even more percent of physicians who don't know how to handle that question. So I tried to normalize it in that way and say, if you talk to the average physician, they're a little intimidated by the answer too. So you should not worry. You should go ahead anyway and keep asking questions. These are intelligent people. They have gotten through numerous barriers in their lives. They've often served in difficult locations, if not also being in combat. Out of respect for that, ask them questions. They actually probably know the way to get to the right answer, but their thinking has narrowed down in such a way that they're not processing things. It's kind of like getting tunnel vision, and you can't see other options, you can't see other ways around things. And so we just wanted to say to our staff, just to ask questions. If they say something back, ask them to tell you more about it. If they continue to say things back and you're really getting concerned, say things like, is there anybody else that you've talked to about this? Again, keep the questions going, because before you know it, they're going to start to see where they've not done certain things, and it highlights to them how they may have disconnected themselves. So we found that video very helpful. I had feedback from many staff members who actually used it, found someone suicidal and got them to resources. So I felt very, very proud of our company for just being proactive and getting that information out there and trying to catch these people as they're starting to come back into the physical network, but also being willing to have those conversations virtually. I think they were afraid to do so during COVID, and that opened it up. Looking out to the veterans and the families that we serve, it's a little different. We put in play a review process. We had some staff that used to run the de-stress program for the Marines. It was a crisis line. All of that has rolled over to Military OneSource, and so that contract had ended. I had numerous psychiatric nurses as well as psychologists who had been running that line, had been supporting that line, as well as peer supports that we used. And so we repurposed them to where they are now screening every mental health referral that comes through us. We are looking for any signs that this person could be in a distress, that could be at risk. They will contact that veteran. They will ask them how often they can reach out to them until they get to their first appointment. They will call them the day after, make sure it was a good fit. If there was any trouble whatsoever, they're there to pick it up really quickly and get it back on track. And I think that was a really helpful process. We've seen some really meaningful interactions with some of our veterans around that. They get to choose how often they want the contact. They get to choose how that conversation goes. It keeps them in control and in power over this. And it really shows that we're invested in getting them to the right care for them. And that's just been critical.
Well, I hear you reinforcing a couple things that we heard earlier too, especially the listening aspect, the listen, and don't be afraid to ask questions. There's so many things already, but I want to, Max, thank you for being here and representing J.P. Morgan Chase and your exceptional work now there, especially including diversity, equity, and inclusion, the things you've done in your company, I know with organizations here like Student Veterans of America. When you look at wellness and mental health, you've talked about the importance of employment. Can you elaborate a little? And then I've got some deeper questions to ask everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jim and organization, thank you for having me again. I do not have a PhD, unlike everyone else on this stage, but one thing that I like to think I'm an expert in is getting veterans hired and helping them find meaningful careers. We have a dedicated diversity, equity, and inclusion group at JP Morgan. It is made up of 7 centers of excellence that focus on each different marginalized community, and that is their full-time job, all day, every day, working with these communities to help them small business, get their careers and skills, help their financial health, and then develop their community. So one thing that we do with Military and Veteran Affairs is we've got numerous programs. So one of our programs is called the Military Pathways Program, and through this program we found that if you want to help veterans' mental health, remove that financial burden from them. So if they're stressed out that they have a bad job, not a career, a job, and they're not sure if they're going to be able to put food on the table and not be able to take care of their family, that increases that stress and it puts them in a corner. So with our different programs, we have a program where a veteran 5 years removed from the service can come in and they get to pick what line of business across the entire huge organization. They get to interview the different lines of business and, different leaders, and the leaders pitch for them. So they are basically interviewing the leaders to try to get them to say, okay, is this a good fit for me, yes or no? And we've got like a 96% retention rate through people who go through that program. And a lot of the feedback we've gotten is this leads to solid careers, and it really helps them feel like they belong. And one of our big slogans in DE&I is, you belong here. And by really giving them a good career, helping them get jobs, participating in the Veteran Jobs Mission, which I'm sure I'll talk about more later. It really puts that kind of mental burden at ease.
Thank you. There's so much each of you focus on, and I'd like to go now just a little bit deeper into, specifically, we'll come back to, let's start with the employment. What is that program you want to, what does it mean to have existential, when you're looking at the stigmas, how do you have a comprehensive mental health approach that looks at the whole person, those aspects that you mentioned, Brian? I want to make sure I understand everything that you're doing in the community, because I understand it touches the children too, which is so important. So if you all could just spend a few minutes looking at those. I do want to ask about metrics. How do you know what you're doing is beneficial? The last panel talked to us about their discovery of the benefit of physical exercise and how that was helping the mental health. So I want to always look at the metrics, but then how are you collaborating in the community and with the folks out here? And if not yet, how can they reach you to do that? So start a little.
Okay, so the Veteran Jobs Mission, so 10 years ago, well, now 11, Chase foreclosed upon a helicopter pilot's home. He was deployed, he was in combat, foreclosed upon his home, took his home. It was a mistake. And we could have just taken the fine, tried to sweep it under the rug, but our chairman and CEO, Jamie Dimon, said, no, we need to acknowledge, one, we made a mistake, and then how can we do better? So he was at a dinner with Admiral Mike Mullen, and he asked Admiral Mullen, how can we help them? And he said, get them jobs. So they came up with the idea, the 100,000 Jobs Mission. And one of the most important things is it's not the JP Morgan 100,000 Jobs Mission, because there would be exactly one company in it. No one else would join the JP Morgan 100,000 Jobs Mission. So he called a bunch of other CEOs, and I believe it started with 10 companies. And their original goal was 100,000 jobs. They blew through that in like a year and a half. and that was a 10-year goal. So they said, all right, let's just change it to the veteran jobs mission. So it's grown to this year, we should hit 1 million veterans hired in 10 years across over 250 different companies. It's free to join. You know, we don't ask anything of you, but the companies benefit by being a part of the Veteran Jobs Mission. They get to benefit on all the work we do. And again, our full-time staff in the Military and Veteran Affairs Office administers the thing, does all the data collection, and we track those metrics on, you know, what companies are hiring the most. And then we'll go to them and say, okay, you're hiring the most. How are you doing that? What are you doing different than these other companies? You know, like what need are you fulfilling? And one of the other things to touch on the metrics piece, Jamie Dimon gave a speech on Monday at an event I was at, run by one of the Women on the Move, so it's the women-focused Center of Excellence. And Jamie, in his way, if you've ever heard him speak, very bluntly said, like, we can give a bunch of money out, but what are we doing with it? Like, what is our kind of return on investment? And not in like a banker way, but in like, we're giving you $100,000. How many people are you hiring? How many touch points are you making? Are you getting like people financial health? What are you doing to help them? So we're not just, you know, throwing money away. It's very targeted, and every single dollar that we spend in our organization is vetted by a CFO who says, what are your impact metrics? You know, what are you going to follow up with these organizations to make sure that you actually accomplish what you were trying to accomplish?
And you do this because you know the ultimate impact is that veteran it has on them, which is important as opposed to the corporation getting another person, another body, even if it's addressing their DEI issues, but it's because of what it does for the veteran.
Absolutely, and that's where it always ends up, right? Like, we care about the people that we serve. We didn't go into, you know, DE&I to make $1 million. That's not like where we're at. That's, you know, I can go to the private bank and go do that. So we came there because we care about the populations we serve and we want to help them. And that's what we want to do with our full-time jobs. And, you know, luckily the firm supports us and pays us to do that.
That's great. That's a great example of corporate responsibility, and I love that you're measuring them too. Can you tell us, Brian, Dr. Brian, the concept you have of wellness and the existential nature of it, how do you see not only mental health, but how do you see employment and other aspects, the spiritual aspect even, as a component of that?
Yeah, so what we've been doing at United Health Group, at OptumServe, Optum Behavioral Health, these are very important aspects that we looked at. I mean, here again, tell you an Admiral Mullen story. But what we really do is look at that shield of fitness, and some people will know about that shield of fitness that was brought in when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and really looking at the physical health, the mental health, the psychological health, nutritional, spiritual, social. These are all important aspects of what makes us a person. It's about our relationships. Purposeful employment is also key to getting that sense, particularly with the veteran community and even with our children and our spouses. They understand what it is to serve. I mean, we just don't serve ourselves. I mean, it's our families that serve. It's our families that are also committed, that support us in those initiatives that we feel that we have to do for the country. And I think that really looking at those aspects of that are key to us at OptumServe and United Health Group, really bringing people on board in our fellowship program. And we're looking at how many people are we bringing in through the fellowship program. They have that terminal leave time period after they are getting ready to make that transition. And this really ties in nicely to mental well-being, because we all go through transitions in our life. You know, the big transition that most military people feel is coming out of wearing the cloth of our country to, you know, corporate America or our own business or whatever. It's those transitions. But we go through transitions all our lives, from kindergarten to first grade, from high school to college, from college to the working environment. But it's those transitions. The most the biggest one that we often deal with is coming out of the military to civilian. And so those create existential angst. You know, when you look at what existentialism is about, it's about what value do we impart in our lives? What are the relationships that we build? And one of the big issues that is about existentialism is understanding that we're mortal and that death and dying issues are very key. That's one reason why you see a lot of people later on in life really start to understand the value of health and well-being. You know, when we're younger, we're, you know, let's go tear up the world, let's go build our careers, let's do this, that, whatever. And then all of a sudden, the second mountain comes up to us. And that second mountain is, am I on the right peak? And what is the value? What is my legacy truly going to be? Okay, and what purposefulness do I have to contribute? And I think that those things are very valuable for people that become unmoored when they move.
And I hear you saying the transition experience needs to be normalized, and almost that people need to be coached along that it is likely that these are key moments in which certain disruptions can occur, and
Right.
you may be more vulnerable than at other times.
Right, and as we talked about before, you know, during our time, you know, the Presidential Study Directive 9 came out from the Obama administration. And it was led by the First Lady and the Second Lady, who's now the First Lady. And the whole issue of how do we help our military members and their families, okay? And it was a very interesting discussion that we had about also, well, what is it that also military families can teach the country when it is in turmoil? Because that is really a key aspect too. And that is, like I said, suicide, domestic violence, alcoholism, substance abuse. These are all manifestations of a stressed society. And so how do you deal with that? And as a corporate entity, how can you set the example? Because one of our beliefs within United Health Group and OptumServe is that we have a responsibility to also be good stewards of the resources, but also help our society in diversity and inclusiveness, health disparities, disenfranchised communities. And so how do you go in there and use what you've been given, okay, because to much that is given, much is expected.
Right.
And we take that seriously.
Thank you, and I know you do personally a lot of coaching of other corporations on issues like this. Dr. Lori, building on what Brian just said, give me some examples of how you've incorporated your work in the communities, with the families, with the children, that comprehensive approach, and what you've learned from that, please.
Sure. I think one that's recent that we've both been a part of is the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. As a proud Kansan, I'm pleased to be a part of that. And it's really about being a detective out there. Who are the people around this veteran? Sometimes there's no one. Sometimes it's a child. And so being able to see more clearly who this person has and how they're able to get their support, I think is important. But there's also another piece to this that I've brought up in that discussion before, which is children need to be children. You know, it sort of adultifies them a little too early when they take on a strong caregiver role. And yet, how could they not? You know, they love their parent, they see the need, they step in. And you want to respect that, but you also want to recognize that if it's a child that's the main support, we need to really think about how we're supporting this child and how we could support the veteran in a couple of ways that could take a little bit off, you know, someone in the home that's not even 18 yet and trying to get through school and trying to deal with social media and all the other things that they have to stress over, much less being a caregiver to an adult. So I think you know, the work with that group to try to get this information out into the medical communities and other resources that veterans will tap into so that we can better recognize when this is happening and better support the supports, I think is essential.
So it may be that the de-stress clinicians that used to specialize with the Marines, now that you have them, they're able to also do really a family assessment. If there's a caregiving responsibility in the family, we know that being a caregiver is a degradation of your own health, mental health, your well-being, your financial earnings, certainly. And that's why we've got a big emphasis on the employment of family and spouses, especially male and veteran spouses now. But there was a mention, too, of when you and Brian were talking about there's a resilience aspect that we have in our military and veteran community and their families, not just this risk factor. So the resilience, though, in these points of transition, Brian, how does that come into play? And you might talk about how employment helps contribute to resilience. Because we know when it comes to suicide, there are times when no matter how resilient you are, or when I broke my kneecap, or I have my own behavioral health challenges, it doesn't matter what resilience I have. There are times when I just can't, I'm in the pits, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And we know that any loss impacts 150 of the associated people in that individual's orbit. We all are impacted. We're all at greater risk, when we lose somebody. So talk a little bit about the specifics of that dichotomy of being resilient and yet being vulnerable.
Well, let me share something personally from this. So my father was a Korean War combat veteran, and when he was passing away, he literally was right next to me. Honestly, he was on me, hugging me when he died. That man, right before he died, the thing he was so worried about and said to me was, "I think I need a priest." And I said, well, why, Dad? And he went back to his time serving in the military. He was terrified. As a Catholic man, he was terrified he was going to go to hell. And I had to, as a caregiver, I'm taking time away from my work. I was working in the VA at the time. I'm taking my time away from there. I'm trying to be there for him, my family. I'm the only medical person that's kind of holding it together. And then that comes on you, and you're not expecting some of these things. It's really hard. I can say those wounds are deep. They do not go away easily. He was 86 when he passed, so it's been about 10 years ago now. That was one of his last thoughts. So to not take into account the existential issues, now this wasn't suicide, but think about that though, for someone who's even considering taking their life, like these issues are coming up. And if you can tap into that and talk to them on their level and try to let them get it out, I think you have a better chance of them respecting and trusting you going forward, because they tend to isolate down. And my dad was married to my mom for 54 years. She was right there in the next room. He didn't have the conversation with her. He had it with me. So you have to really think about how all these factors do play together, and how you as a person, a family member, a friend, how can you connect with a person you don't know is suicidal? I always think of it as, the mailman that comes by every day. When my dad was still alive and in Kansas, he knew him by first name. It meant something that he said hello. It was someone who noticed he was alive. That's not true for everybody. And in those situations, they desperately need a connection. They need to be seen. And to just know that someone saw them and could have that kind of conversation with them is what can have them have some faith, some feeling of they can wait that 12 hours more, a day longer, maybe a week longer. It's really important.
It's back to your listening emphasis that you were talking about with this, that you coached the staff on in that film. It also called up to me, we hear that over and over again, the veterans may not want to talk about their service, especially if it's combat, and may never. And why do they all want to, though, hang out in a VA lobby, and it's just these old guys with their baseball caps and, you know, well, there's a connection and a being seen, and it's the only group that gets it, you know. So talk about that a little, Brian, the getting it.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good intro to getting it and being part of and being accepted, you know. When I started my training, as we talked about, you know, I had no gray hair, no beard, and I walked into this room with a group of veterans, World War I vet, a couple of World War IIs. Actually, two of them were in the Bataan Death March. Some Vietnam vets, a couple Medal of Honor recipients. It was a very interesting group, and here I am, first group that I'm doing. And learning from this, and one of the guys in the room says, "Oh, hell no, we aren't going to have this guy." And there's a World War I vet, and he just said, "Shut the F up, you never know what you might learn from a kid." But it was very interesting because I learned a lot. I did this group for 5 years during my entire training, and got to really understand a lot of the issues, you know, that they wanted to talk about. And they didn't share this with family. They didn't share it with people that didn't understand. And it took me, from when I left there to I am sitting, getting mortared in Balad, which we got mortared every day. They called it Mortareeville. And I get this email. And it was an individual who said that he always was suicidal. And it was the same guy that said, "Oh, hell no," at the very beginning. And he sent this email to me. And I mean, this is like 20 years later. And in the email, all he said was, "Welcome to the club, CW." And that was all he said.
Now he understood he could accept you as one of them.
And being in that and being accepted and being understood that what they are experiencing they may not share. After I got back from the war, or from Iraq, I was actually at a Christmas party with my family. And my wife's grandfather was a medic in the Ardennes. Okay. And he went back to his room, came out, and had a book. It was a book of the 100th and what they did. And it was a whole story. And he handed it to me. And my father-in-law and my wife's uncle both looked at her grandfather and said, "Well, why didn't you give that to us?" And he looked at him and said, "You wouldn't understand." And I think that that's really the power of connecting the relationships. And it's building those relationships that is critical, and that's part of the existentialism. I mean, we as beings come into this world alone and leave this world alone, but it's the relationships along the way that we develop. And we never, you know, in D.C., we've been in D.C., there's rivalries between the services. But in combat, in that foxhole, there is no difference in service. And I think that that's really an important aspect of putting those values and developing those relationships, which is part of the existential nature.
That touched in a very special way because you wouldn't get it. We hear that with not only the veterans, but the families, caregivers, and survivors too. Our community is a unique one. It's inclusive in that sense, but it's also purple. As Dr. Rowe, Chairman Rowe, was talking about, you know, we put the politics generally aside when we come in, when we're in the uniform. It doesn't matter to us. And we continue to serve that way together, which is a gift. It isn't in other places. But it sounds like there's a role here, a key role for peer support in terms of mental health, even in terms of identifying risk factors, and even within, when you're looking at diversity, equity, inclusion max, and looking at employment, how do you make sure that, like Lori said, that your corporate employees are listening? How do you help them get it? And how do you you've created these smaller communities where it is more peer-to-peer. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the stories, I can kind of relate is, I told my boss, who's the chief of staff, I said, I have to go to the VA, I've got to go to my psychiatrist appointment. And she said, okay, just text me if you need me. And that, and I know I've got some of my competitors here, and I know some certain cultures, that could be a potentially career-killing move, depending on who you said that to. And she did not blink an eye and said, okay, if you need anything, just let me know. And what we try to do is, we believe if you cannot bring your true, authentic self to work, you will not be successful. If you are hiding something, if you are hiding your sexual orientation, or you are hiding a mental health illness, if you are hiding any of these things, you cannot be the best person you can be. And that will, one, impact you, which we definitely do not want to do, and then two, it'll impact the organization, because we'll never get the best version of you. So one of the things we try to do is we have a program called Pathfinder. And for all my Army folks out there, Pathfinder's the one you drop ahead of time, and, they find the path. So for Pathfinder, it's a mentorship program. And it connects our veterans with senior veterans in the firm, and they can ask them anything. So now they've got somebody they can talk to. They've got someone they can say, okay, you've been here for 10, 20, 30 years. I'm dealing with this. How can I help? Or how can you help me? And they provide advice, they provide guidance, and then they give them that sense of belonging. And, every single month throughout the year, you've got, right now it's Hispanic Heritage Month, and then next month we've got the Celebration of Service, which is our big Veterans Day blowout, where we have Veterans Day events pretty much the entire month. But it's really, we celebrate our employees, we encourage them, be the best version of yourself you can be, bring your authentic self, and just be honest, and if you need anything, we've got so many different resources. And on our homepage, and I saw the article yesterday, on our homepage, and we've got 280,000 employees across the world. On our homepage, there was an article on there, and it's called This Is Me, and it was a woman talking about being a suicide survivor. And you wouldn't see that in a lot of corporate America. She was sharing that story with her face and her name and her line of business, and she will not be stigmatized. She will be praised for doing that, because she might have helped somebody else share their story.
Well, sharing our stories has certainly become more common and acceptable. I think even with what happened with COVID, and we're all going through this lockdown, and the Zoom and the social media became even more prominent, and the one way to connect. That's a great culture you describe, and it sounds like it's kind of what Lori was talking about, getting away from HR as a place to go and quietly whisper that I need to go to
Right.
my shrink,
Right. You do an unofficial path. That's what we kind of have at TriWest, is there's sort of an unofficial way you may get to help, and it's based on the see something, say something kind of thing,
Right.
really. So I have different employees that know that I have an open door, even if I'm physically not there with a door. They know that they can bring anything, and if they get an unusual text from an employee they're worried about, they're terrified, first of all, because all of us are afraid the first few times you really encounter that closely. But they know that I know how to deal with it. And if they can put it in my lap at any level from the company, it could be an executive, it could be somebody who's frontline on the phones, that I will stand there and support with them. I don't take it over from them. I want them to learn, and I work alongside them. But having those unofficial pathways, that ability to just be honest and communicate and get support, not having to necessarily go to HR and have EAP be the only route.
Right. So multiple avenues. We are complex individuals with communities of family, communities around us geographically, communities of our fellow veterans, et cetera. As providers, we need to learn how to talk. As fellow employers, we need to know how to listen. As family members, Brian, we need to know how to be there and offer sacred space, it seems like. As we're wrapping up, are there things, knowing the audience here, largely it's not necessarily corporations. You all are in a big one, and believe me, we greatly appreciate that, and the leadership and the collaboration. But are there things that you've extracted that's a lesson learned that you would like to impart that you think is relevant to the communities that they work in?
Yeah, so for all of, in my previous role before I moved into my current role, I was the Director of Operations for our Military and Veteran Affairs team, and I handled a lot of our nonprofit 501c3 relationships. And the one piece of advice I can give you all is corporate America owes everyone everything, right? So they are, yes, they're generating wealth for people, but you know, they're using different tax breaks and everything. And one thing that you all should do is hold them accountable and demand things from them. If you think that a corporation can do more, you should push them to do more. And if that helicopter pilot, if his home did not get foreclosed upon and they didn't start military and veteran affairs, this world would be a less good place, right? I think it would have happened eventually because there's a need there, but if you've identified a need and you have any partners in corporate America, you should go push them and say, here's this need. Look at this Operation Deep Dive. This is an epidemic. How can you help? And demand they help. They've got the money. They can afford it.
And we have your contact information.
And you have my contact information, yes.
I think that one of the important aspects, just following on, is the importance of listening. And I think that with our colleagues, they're usually scared to ask that question. You know, are you suicidal? And it's actually been pretty interesting. One of my young adults, you know, the person was kind of hinting around. You know, have you ever thought about whatever? And she said, do you mean do I want to kill myself? And it shocked the person. And I think that that's really an important aspect, is that we can all ask that question. We can all ask the question of, do you feel so bad that you want to hurt yourself? Now, granted, you want to have what are the resources at my disposal, and our company is putting out many things about where do you go, who do you contact, you know, and the care engagement psychiatrists, we as a group support throughout the organization. And so, and then there are many of my colleagues that within United Health Group that are psychiatrists, that are social workers, and we have those dialogues about how do you feel, you know, after you've presented cases or whatever, but how do you feel? And it's okay to ask some of those things, and it's okay to know those resources and go to those resources. And if they aren't there, then just exactly what's the leadership going to do to provide those resources and make sure. And I think that that's really the important aspect about this. Coming here was an eye-opening experience. I mean, the number of people that we work with in OptumServe is just immense, and I didn't even know it. You know, it's just a wonderful thing. So I want to thank you for allowing me to be here today, because it really, truly was an eye-opening experience.
Thank you. And Lori, in terms of that,
Yeah, just a last thought I guess I would put out there is if you're thinking about who gets suicidal, who may be at risk, who has lost hope, it's often people you are not thinking it's going to be. I know this partly because I do get these folks from within our company that get kind of diverted to me to talk and see what we need to do to help. But I would also say, I have a tiny private practice still that I do. My last 2 referrals in my private practice were 2 individuals in their 70s, very affluent, and you would never have known. They had no mental illness. It was an extremely impulsive act that they had a suicide attempt, and I was seeing them post-hospital. You would have never thought that these individuals were at risk. So what I would encourage is for people to start practicing kind of having that conversation as much as you're comfortable. You know, just asking someone, you know, hey, how are you doing with things? You know, Are you still feeling hopeful? How is it going? If you're not comfortable saying the word suicide, there are ways to talk around it. Believe me, they know what you're asking them. So you're not fooling anyone, but just practicing having that conversation, because you never know when you're going to need it with a family member, a close friend, your own child. You really need to get more comfortable asking, and asking people you don't necessarily think are in that space, because I bet you're going to find some.
Yeah, thank you very much. And especially, we all know, we all have those moments of transition. We all have the moments of being up and down. And we know that there's the behavioral health professionals, there's not enough. There is no way, especially as we go into the additional challenges of not only the increasing number of veteran caregivers, but all the veterans now who are going to have to be supported holistically because of the new PACT Act, which you'll hear tomorrow from John from VEO-VA. Our community is not dwindling in terms of the tail. We may have challenges with the numbers recruiting, et cetera, but we have a long tail. We have, I'm old and I'm going to get older, but I have a long tail. So watch out. I'm going to need a lot of things, and we don't have enough professionals. So we need the resources our corporate friends are creating, the lessons that you're learning, the sharing of those, so we don't have to go and create them. We need partnerships. People in here who aren't already a partner with one of these corporations, come talk to them. Come tell them. You're invited. And I thank AWP so much for enabling us to talk about these three key topics. I see it as a continuum. Sometimes we're that we've got that wellness. Sometimes we need a little help with the mental health. And when that's not working well, then some of us feel hopeless. And how do we address that continuum so it's not terrifying? And we can be there to listen and to join in with those that we are including as part of our community. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim, and thank you to everybody and what you do every single day.